you're on.
Welcome back, everyone, to day 2 of the International Karl Polanyi Conference, the 15th edition. My name is Beverly Best, and I teach in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University, and I'll be your chair for this panel number 6, titled Digital Capitalism and the Pandemic. So because we are the first panel of the day, we're going to begin things with the Territorial Acknowledgement. Concordia University occupies unceded indigenous lands. The Ganyankahaga Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. Jojoke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So we'll begin by, I'll go through the order of the speakers and the presentations. We're going to follow the order of that's in the program. So we'll begin with a presentation authored by Julianna Faludi and Michelle Crosby. Julianna Faludi from Media Marketing and Design Communications, Corvinus University, Hungary, and Michelle Crosby from the Institute of Sociology and Social Policy, Corvinus University, Hungary. And the title of their presentation is Profit Shifting, Automation, and the Double Movement. Then we'll go to Ilias Alami, a postdoctoral researcher with the Understanding Sovereign Wealth Funds in Europe project, Maastricht University, Netherlands, and a co-author of that paper, Adam D. Dixon, from Technology and Social Studies, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University, Netherlands. And the title of their presentation is Uneven and Combined State Capitalism. And then our third speaker is Chikako Nakayama from Contemporary Global Studies, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Japan. And the title of her presentation is Money as Means of Payment in International and Communal Context of Our Age. So we'll turn to Julianna and Michelle for the first presentation, again, titled Profit Shifting, Automation, and the Double Movement. And I'll just remind everyone, please submit your questions to the Q&A function. We're going to have the 3 presentations in a row, and then the Q&A at the end. But I just want to remind you to please be concise with your questions, and perhaps it's also helpful to, at the very beginning, indicate whom the question is for, so that, because I'm going to be gathering up the end, it might be for one particular set of presenters, or it might be for all the panelists, a more general question for everyone. But if you could let us know that, and then be concise, 1 or 2 sentences, a short paragraph at most, so that we can read them out to everybody as we go along. Julianna, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for this great opportunity at this fantastic conference, which is so inspiring. And let me present ourselves with Michelle. Michelle and I, we work together on innovation, especially on the intersection between economic sociology and innovation studies. I myself was pursuing research in the past years on digital social entrepreneurship and social innovation. And this paper will look through the automation and the narratives around automation, with the calculations around the impact of automation, which is being challenged also the fears and the perceptions of the digitization automation processes from the perspective of the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, and especially the lockdowns on the economy. And let me share you my slides at this point. Okay. And this is the outline of the argument, which I'm going to go through at this moment. Automation, we see automation as a process which is going on. We know it's already here, it's unstoppable, and it's actually strengthening. So our economies are really switching toward the automation. There is a huge question of core and periphery in this process, who are the economies who will benefit, who are benefiting from automation, and which are the economies who will be left behind or already lagging behind. What is this core periphery structure, and who is responsible for the periphery in the process? So there's a global labor market implication, and there's also a local labor market implication of automation. And we use the idea of the fictitious commodities of labor and try to understand how labor can or not or shall be decommodified in this process of automation. What are the opportunities of decommodifying labor? Are there other areas in our lives which will be commodified as a result by automation and digitization processes? And we, of course, understand this in the context, in the logic of the platform or digital economy. And we need to understand, again, if it's a window of opportunity or is it something which creates growing inequalities. And we will come up with a set of solutions, or probably ideas, I would say, more modestly, to think through for the next agenda of research and maybe even policy making. So let me just highlight some of the ideas before I go into the data that we analyzed. And so basically the pandemic and the lockdown have reinforced all these processes of placing out the workspace and the ones to be public services on the households, which we all perfectly know since a year. Schooling, care work, social services, and even the workspace has shifted into our homes. Meanwhile, the surveillance of home office arrangements and state measures have reshuffled our boundaries of private, public, corporate time and space, and even the way we organize our paid and unpaid labor. The protective mechanisms of regulations, despite the promising steps and efforts of for example, of the EU on this matter to protect people from the devastation caused also by the corporate control and the control of the tech giants over the economies, is still lagging behind, and it still needs to address a lot of issues. But let me get back to more specifically to the effects of automation. The discussion about automation is basically, as I already mentioned, is framed by the threat of unemployment. We are scared of being unemployed as a consequence of the automation. And these fears have been intensified by the pandemic crisis. And there are also further industries that are stepping in, which we didn't think about before, because they're trying to eliminate the person-to-person interaction. And to save these industries that can be affected by the lockdowns and by the pandemic, is basically pushing the industries toward this automation process. So the most important things is that automation taking jobs, pandemic induces this transformation. And these assumptions are all around the studies that we see. Will robots take the jobs? Well, automation technologies include industrial and social robots too. So we need to understand not just the industrial ones, but also the artificial intelligence, the chatbots, speaker recognition technology, which is spreading around social media as well, which is a large share of how we organize ourselves and how we present ourselves as labor force in the labor market, and represents a huge part of our unpaid work to be valuable on the labor market. And of course, we also need to not to forget the Internet of Things, which provides a lot of control through the digitalized space of the labor market and our private lives. But getting back again to the automation thing. Based on a decade of data on the automation process of industrial plants, Acemoglu and Restrepo just very recently found and proved that robots do increase productivity and lower the average wage of a worker in the local economy. So understanding again the locality. They also show that these industries adopting robots employ less workers through the displacement effect that creates unemployment in the local areas, which actually produces a new class of people being crowded out from the labor market because the robots. And the other argument, if we look at the entire economy, and we know that industries fall and rise and die out and emerge, and the transformation of modes of production, they evoke further industries that emerge. But basically people who are being crowded out, they cannot catch up with these new opportunities of job creation in the whole economy. So automation technologies don't bring shared prosperity by themselves. They need to be combined with other technological changes that create these jobs in the economy. Yeah. Here we see basically the top 10 automated countries, and we compare the unemployment rates in 2019 and 2020 just to see if it is a reality that the pandemic shock has actually had this effect on unemployment. And we see that the top 10 automatized countries, which represent the core in this perspective, are not really shaken by unemployment during this past year. There's only two countries I would like to highlight: Hong Kong, which had a huge shift in the unemployment rate, and South Korea, which also suffered from this. Also need to understand that some countries do produce robotics and automation for exporting, and other countries are adopting more than producing automation. And this is why we see, for example, the United States on the 7th place, because, for example, United States produces less automatics and develops less solutions in this matter. They are more into adopting these technologies. So there is also, we can see that there's this struggle between the countries going on, but these, as I mentioned already, represent the core. But the impact on humanity, which I already raised as an issue, which are the uncharted territories that automation will take from human beings to render them commercialized, is the question. Thinking of the social space of human-to-human interaction, we must understand that automatized way of interacting within some services and the dehumanizing effect of it without machines, because machines represent the dehumanized humans. And we can easily recall Taylorism, which actually by automatizing, we have relieved workers from the dehumanizing type of work while creating unemployment on the other hand. But it was giving floor for more meaningful jobs and for shifting production modes, which were less human-centered toward more human-centered management jobs. To give you another point here is, the predictions based on a survey of adult skills by Georgiev and Milanese, they actually, what they looked into the employment platforms such as LinkedIn, and they were predicting by 2025 what type of jobs will be around and how it will shift the whole labor market. And we can see that those new jobs, they will be all related basically to the digitalization and automatized solutions. So AI will take over a lot of things, and basically the coordination of automatized processes will create the further jobs. But still, there is a question remaining about, if you think about the example of the Amazon workers, and if you have seen the discussions on how Amazon, which is the third biggest employer in the world, is taking over mechanized solutions in the warehouses, we can see that basically robots are controlling humans nowadays, and robots many times take over the managerial tasks instead of the manual work. Just to give you a small example, human hands picking goods and packaging them are still much more sensitive than robotized hands, which also very expensive at the moment. So we can also understand this less or positivistic or narratives from the technological determinism bringing all the beneficial effects, that it's not the case every time. So still the slavery, let's say, or the low-skilled jobs will be controlled or are being already controlled by automatized managerial solutions, let's say, is also around. Yes, let me just get to the digital economy. As a new entrepreneurial class emerged out of the remnants of old classes, which lay in with the interest of the community as a whole, as following Polanyi, so do the new digital entrepreneurs emerge, many with a socially, morally engaged focus. Digital entrepreneurship is expanding with a variety of missions as business models across borders, and the public discourse around the effects of the pandemic, the social erosion due to fear, isolation, and loss of human lives, and economic challenges that may need to overcome, and needs addressed by apps, live streaming services in the digital sphere. So we actually see an upheaval and a rise of digital entrepreneurialism, which is much coordinated and organized by the big tech giants, by the platform providers, which also raises an issue that the coordination mechanism, or even of the entrepreneurship, is very much centralized. And if how and what possibilities do we have actually to overcome this centralized coordination, even of the social digital entrepreneurship there. But this is a unique opportunity also for platforms to create an infrastructure for social digital entrepreneurship. And we do need some indigenous, let's say, or community-based platforms to be better organized and to compete somehow in this field, to challenge the big platform and the expansionist movement of these big platforms. Yes. I'm not sure how much time that I have here. So the entrepreneurship for good is one of the opportunities that shall be grabbed. And as the new digital entrepreneurs are being tied to these platform structures, as I said, some state intervention should also encourage all those initiatives to take over. And of the state is crucial in inducing this process and establishing those frameworks with regulatory forces, for example. And this is where the intergovernmental forces shall also come into the picture more for rebuilding the economy.
A few minutes now, Julianna.
Yes, and this better orchestration and coordination for this reaching of the goals. The conclusion is that the society of automation is what we are witnessing, the building up of this society. And as the industrial economy could only exist in this industrial society, this is how the automation society is emerging. And modern societies embrace technology through culture, and we are creating this culture, which is a problem because we tend to think that AI is capable of unbiased decision making, that discrimination will disappear, but these algorithms actually not helping at all, because they are sustaining patterns of social mechanisms, which are gender and race and etc. and age biased in the long run. So this absolutely needs also to be disassembled if we're heading toward this society of automation, means entering the new era. And so to sum up, we need inclusive technologies and inclusive technology design that shall be fostered by the companies and the intergovernmental and state design. And this, it has to be this, to conclude also the disparities among the countries globally. Technology does reinforce the disparities of the core periphery that I tried to highlight couple of sentences before, because technological change has impact on inequality, which is not being addressed at the moment. So this shift in production from manual labor intensive industries without creating new opportunities and relieving the social costs in the periphery would mean placing the risk of industrial change on those countries. And to end up with the future agenda of the research, What we highlighted here is the impact of automation on the global inequalities, that not too many studies are being around, inclusive innovation design considering global stakeholders and local labor market arrangements, these dynamics, and that there's no economic self-healing, as we know. And the global devastation, the pressure of exchanges has to be considered. And for that, as I mentioned already, the national and international governmental policies shall be in focus for restructuring the industrial sectoral setup. Thank you.
Thank you, Julianna. There we go. Thanks a lot. Okay, we'll move on to the second presentation, which is co-presented by Ilias Alami and Adam D. Dixon. And the title of their presentation is Uneven and Combined State Capitalism.
You're muted.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that one. Mm-hmm. I'll share the screen.
No, I don't think you're... perhaps stop sharing and share again and click on this one. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Is that it?
And full screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that work?
Good.
You're good? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon from us here in the Netherlands. So I'm Adam Dixon, and Ilias Alami will be following me after a few slides. So I'll start us off. So the title of our paper is Uneven and Combined State Capitalism. It's part of a project that is funded by the European Research Council that focuses in particular on sovereign wealth funds, which are state-owned institutional investors, but we use these really as an empirical entry point into talking about other issues around state intervention, state capitalism, and so on and so forth. So the coronavirus, the current pandemic that we're living in, has seen significant revival of the state, partly as a necessity, just as we saw in the 2008 financial crisis. But we see this across countries, big and small, particularly in the global north, and those that we typically refer to as, let's say, more neoliberal political economies. Here's a nice picture just to give you an idea of it, where we see, now some of these people aren't there anymore, in particular Donald Trump, but we see a return of the state. And what's interesting is that there seems to be a quite profound ambivalence around the return of the state amongst financial analysts, business journalists, liberal commentators, and other pundits, where on the one hand, the state is seen as a savior, but also at the same time as a gravedigger. But it's not really, if you like, there's the significant ideological pushback that you would probably expect. There's a lot more, let's say, acceptance of state intervention. Now, that doesn't mean that there are some that see it as a pejorative development, right? So here is a quote from a Deutsche Bank research note, which asks, are we on our way to state capitalism? Now, to be sure, even though we are in this coronavirus pandemic, state intervention, the growth of the state was already happening, even before the 2008 financial crisis. So for example, looking at what we refer to as state capital hybrids, so sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises, just in terms of sovereign wealth funds, for example, there are now 127 of them, which is more than a six-fold increase since 2000. Now, many of them are still quite small, but even still, in total, you have a growth of state-owned investment funds that are investing in global capital markets and are major investors in some sectors. At the same time, if we look at SOEs, we see a remarkable revival. And over the past decade, they have doubled in importance amongst the largest 2,000 firms. At $45 trillion, their assets are now equivalent to half of global GDP. So state enterprises are very, very significant. At the same time, if we look at these together, these are what we would say is a major force of transnationalizing capital, actively participating in cross-border mergers and acquisitions, cross-listing of shares, international portfolio investment, and foreign direct investment. So if we think of in the past of state-owned enterprises or state investment banks, for example, as being primarily domestic concerns, what we see increasingly is that these state entities are very much transnational and very much global. That doesn't mean that they all are, but to a larger extent than we've seen in the past, they are. At the same time, we see a return to fashion of national development and policy banks. Now, this is clearly the case in the global south, where there's a significant growth of national development banks, but we also see a rekindling of national development banks or national investment funds for domestic investment in the global north, in the advanced democracies, in Europe, in the United States. There's discussion recently about a national investment fund. Now, this probably won't ever get off the ground, but still, you see more and more discussion around national development and policy banks. At the same time, we see a return to techno-industrial policy and national development strategies. So just to put this into perspective, a quote from UNCTAD in 2018, in the decade since the global financial crisis, the number of countries adopting national industrial development strategies has increased dramatically. The rate of adoption of both formal industrial policies and individual policy measures targeted at industrial sectors appears to be at an all-time high. So the world is changing, right? So before, if you said industrial policy in the 20 years ago at the IMF or the World Bank, people would say, oh, we don't do that anymore. But now the word industrial policy is something that's quite active on the lips of policymakers around the world, and even in those places that we tend to think of as rather neoliberal or free market. At the same time, adding trade wars, neo-mercantilist policies, unconventional monetary policies, so quantitative easing, where you see vast amounts of assets being hoovered up by central banks, which are, we have to remember, are state-sponsored entities, even if they are independent. Coupled with massive bailouts to the private sector and so on and so forth. So we see more and more state. Let's not say that the state ever left per se, but we see more and more state that comes out in more explicit terms. Now, in terms of academic research on this, we see more and more interest in scholarship that is dealing with what we call state capitalism. And this has become a rubric or a label which has gained increasing purchase across the social sciences, as well as in business and political commentary, to register the more visible role of the state across the world capitalist economy. So there is an academic literature, but at the same time, in the pages of the Financial Times or the Economist, those the liberal bastions of the business press, you see more and more this term state capitalism. Now, that doesn't mean that there's congruence across these literatures, or there's a unified agreement on what constitutes state capital or state capitalism. And it's a product. There's quite a bit of debate. So there's a paper that Ilias and I published in 2020 in the journal Competition and Change, which I recommend you look at, which reviews this literature. But for the most part, much of this literature, there's a tendency to conceive of state capitalism as the rise of a new state-led national model of capitalism, which increasingly competes with free market capitalism. And here, often it's the country they're speaking most about is China as being the state-led political form of capitalism. But our work actually tries to push against this, and Ilias will say more.
Yes. Let me take over. Hi, everyone. So let me say a few words on the approach that we propose as an alternative to understand this renewal or this revival of the state. So instead of speaking of a national variety of state capitalism, we propose the concept of uneven and combined state capitalism. And so rather than the negation of an abstract model of free market capitalism, we see the rise of state capitalism, so the processes that we have described earlier, as a process of state restructuring, which must be grasped as a moment of the dynamic process of capital accumulation. And we think that this is a global process happening, not a national, primarily national process. So for us, state capitalism is not an anomaly or a deviance from liberal market-based capitalism, but is a particular modality of expression of the capitalist state, including in its liberal form. So we try and understand state capitalism as an immanent potentiality an impulse which is contained in the form of the capitalist state and built into its DNA, so to speak. So again, this is quite different from most of the literature, which tends to present state capitalism as this kind of abnormal version or deviant version of normal capitalism. So one of the arguments that we make in our work is that the contemporary advent of state capitalism must be located within a set of processes and social relations pertaining to the historical development and geographical remaking of global capitalism. And we emphasize in particular 4 tendencies towards what we call state capitalist impulses. So let me go through these in turn. The first tendency that we identify is that states have developed new forms of intervention and modalities of government-business cooperation in order to ensure the favorable participation of their firms in global value chains. So this is a process which has involved a reconfiguration of industrial and innovation policy, including the use of policy banks, the creation of national champions and other forms of strategic support to industry to make sure that firms can coordinate and integrate the various stages of production along global value chains, which is necessary for securing market power and value capture. So, and there's also a very strong or very important spatial and territorial aspect to this process. Hence, the re-emergence over the past few years of spatial planning strategies, which had fallen out of fashion during the neoliberal period. Just to give you an example, a recent study finds that the number of countries with a national development plan has more than doubled from about 62 in 2006 to 134 in 2018. And what we've also seen as part of this tendency is a renewed competition between states to finance and control large-scale infrastructure connectivity in ways that benefit their capitalist firms both at home and abroad. And we'll say a few words on this in a moment and give you some examples, but there's been a renewed competition between, say, China, the US, Western Europe, Japan, India, and so on to finance and build large-scale infrastructure in developing countries as well. And as part of that, states have expanded their role as providers of finance and capital, notably via state enterprises, policy and development banks, and international development agencies. So that's the first tendency that we identify towards state capitalist impulses. The second one is that the new international division of labor, and particularly its acceleration or the acceleration of its unfolding since the late 1990s, has led to the formation of a highly uneven planetary distribution of surplus, which has provided the material basis for an enlargement of a state's role as owner of capital. So just to give you some examples, we've seen the consolidation of export-oriented models in East Asian economies, on the one hand, and the reprimarization of many developing economies in Latin America and Africa, meaning that there's been deindustrialization and those countries focusing again on exporting primary commodities, raw materials, and so on. So this has led to the accumulation of vast amounts of surpluses from commodity export revenues to balance of payment surpluses and the buildup of foreign exchange reserves. And this in turn has provided funding sources which have been used for creating new sovereign wealth funds and expanding existing ones, and a massive expansion of the assets that they control globally. What we've also seen is that in some of these resource-rich developing economies, particularly during the commodity boom, the commodity super cycle, we've seen vast rents from primary commodity experts, providing the material basis for the reincorporation of state enterprises in the design of new developmental and redistributive strategies. And finally, states have also used state enterprises and policy banks to facilitate the concentration, centralization, and internationalization of capital in strategic sectors such as agrochemicals, minerals, and hydrocarbons, including via mergers and acquisition abroad. Thirdly, we argue that the third tendency towards state capitalist impulses is that states have produced new forms of intervention in order to retain sovereignty and secure political legitimacy in the face of capitalist crisis. So as part of the tendency of the processes that we've discussed, so the unfolding of the international division of labor, the global financial crisis, and so on, states have faced a number of challenges and have used state capitalist instruments in order to address them. So to give you some examples again, we've seen sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, capital controls, and other forms of state interventions being deployed in order to mitigate financial volatility, and facilitate macroeconomic management in a context of acute financial instability. We've also seen development banks being used as counter-cyclical tools to offset private credit crunches. We've seen state asset management companies being used to absorb over-accumulated capital and centralize geographically diverse financial risk. And we could also argue that the recent transformations in central banking, especially in advanced economies, such as quantitative easing, the role of lenders and market makers of last resort, and now increasingly the role that central banks play as fiscal actors, could be understood as part of this third tendency that we identify. Fourthly, we argue, and we think this is an important argument because it is rarely discussed in the literature on state capitalism, that there's been important transformations in the technologies of labor containment, which were driven by the need from the perspective of states to discipline and govern vast populations rendered surplus. So
yes,
we look
coming up to the 2-minute mark, just to let you know.
Okay, 2-minute mark. Then I'll accelerate a little bit. Thanks. So yeah, just to say a few words on this tendency, as part of the unfolding of the new international division of labor, as part of automation and labor-saving technologies, which were discussed in the previous presentation, combined with worsening economic stagnation, there's been a depressed global demand for labor, resulting in the multiplication of the surplus population relative to the needs of capital for formal wage labor. And so this has pushed states to develop a number of increasing coercive and repressive forms of rule, from border militarization to systems of mass surveillance and so on and so forth. I'm going to accelerate here a little bit. And yes, and so a number of scholars have tried to grapple with those tendencies, pointing at increasing difficulties for the capitalist state to sustain its liberal form. And people have come up with notions of global police state, planetary illiberalism, authoritarian illiberalism, and so on. And so we do think that this is a fundamental aspect of this rise of new state capitalism, which again is rarely discussed in the literature. Now, I'm going to skip this part for now, but the second part of our argument is basically that in order to understand contemporary state capitalism, we need to understand about, we need to look at those four tendencies, but also at how states or forms of intervention between different spaces in the world economy have combined and developed different forms of interdependence. And we use the example of industrial policy, where if you look at, for instance, the ongoing European project in Europe to create digital champions, this has been in explicit reference to the successes of China and the US in nurturing their own brand of digital champions. And we also use the example of development finance and infrastructure development, where the US, for instance, has just created a new development bank, which has been explicitly designed to compete with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And the EU is at the moment doing similar things, trying to create a global partnership with India and other partners in order to compete with both the US and China. So just to conclude briefly, so what we argue is that instead of seeing contemporary state capitalism as the rise of a new state-led national model of capitalism, which, the paragon of which would be, for instance, China or Russia, and which is allegedly increasingly competing with free market capitalism, we propose instead to understand state capitalism as a process of state restructuring, which is global in scope. So again, not specific to only emerging economies. According to us, this process should be located in dynamics of global uneven development. And we've identified four tendencies towards those, what we call state capitalist impulses, which have led to an expansion of the state's role as promoter, supervisor, and owner of capital. This is the point that I couldn't quite make during the presentation, but state capitalism is also shaped by relations of combination and competitive emulation between various forms of intervention. So I mentioned quickly the example of industrial policy. And finally, just in terms of a few geopolitical implications, we argue that it is unlikely that the rise of state capitalism is going to lead to patterns of institutional convergence or divergence, which have been the primary lenses through which state capitalism studies have looked at those processes. So if you look, for instance, at the very influential book of Brando Milanovic, he argues that the world now is at this kind of crossroads between political capitalism and free market capitalism, and that we might be converging between one of those two. We argue that those type of lenses are not useful. We do argue that state capitalism may well beget more state capitalism. However, this is not going to be a question of one model prevailing over another. This is likely to be characterized by a sort of polycentric restructuring where the global landscapes of state capitalism catalyzed by the dynamic and cumulative unfolding of more muscular state prerogatives across territory and scale. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll turn now to the third and final presentation for this panel, Chikako Nakayama. Over to you with her presentation titled Money as Means of Payment in International and Communal Context of Our Age.
Okay. Make the share screen. Can you see it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Hello, everyone. Okay, maybe I have to do slideshow like this. Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Chairman. My theme today is money as a means of payment in international and communal context of our age. Yeah, hello, my name is Chikako Nakayama. I work at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies in Tokyo, and it's 11:40 at night in Japan, so it's not a nice time for me to make a presentation, but I will do my best. Okay. Sure. So, oh, pardon. Okay, this is my program setting. So I will make the investigation of the role of the state from the perspective of money. Actually, so the COVID-19 has raised the world, and it's not an economic problem itself, but somehow the influence is really economic, and the government each government had to do everything, including the medical things and economic things and everything. And it has reasonably turned out that such amount of tasks could not all successfully be undertaken by the government. In Japan, for example, the leaders of prefectures instead have gradually increased their presence right now, for example. And at first, they were really cautious to see the reaction of the government, and they didn't say anything. But now, well, it's the government doesn't or can't do anything, and we have to say in a communal base or prefecture base and so on. That's the situation now in Japan. Yes, and besides, apart from such a current situation, caused by COVID-19, there has been a growing tendency of consideration and practices of digital money and cryptocurrencies in the recent decade, especially since the birth of Bitcoin around 2008. And we know from the experience in the 20th century that such attempts of non-national monies and currencies tend to prosper, especially in the period of economic predicament, such as in war and post-war period, or in the Great Depression or the economic depressions in general. It may be because people in such period first expect much or too much for the role of their government, and then feel frustrated, disappointed, and tend to deviate from the usual order of the trust and confidence to the current government and to the nation state at all, which is potentially symbolized in legal tender. So we'll examine the history of thought on money as a means of payment. And as a Polanyi conference, it's quite clear, but apart from that too, the Polanyi thought of money is quite useful as a frame of reference. And following Sayag's article in 2014, I would call it as the neo-Polanyian approach. And this is my structure, the structure of my paper, but I will skip it and I will go directly to the contents. The first part is about Capitalism and Polanyi, And normally, Chartism, as you all know, is normally ascribed to Knapp's book, published in 1995, the Stabilitätstheorie des Geldes, or the State Theory of Money. The English translation of it was published in 1924, and there Knapp said, the nominality of debt and nominality of the unit of value is a necessary premise before money can come into being. Money is a means of payment, but not necessarily a material one. And what is the role of the state there? The state can change the means of payment, and they can describe the new means of payment, and then they let the law settle the detail of this new means of payment, and the state further can decide the relation between the old means of payment and the new one. And in that sense, this is the contents of Chartism. And what about Polanyi? He also emphasized this token character of money. Or he said, well, there is no difference between barrel money, gold money, or paper money. So even though he didn't mention Knapp or so directly, Polanyi is surely in line with Chartism. And I'd like to emphasize this point because Chartism nowadays, or recent years, has been narrowed very much because of the presence or because of the growing popularity of MMT, the modern monetary theory. Who the advocates of this theory, they want to narrow the idea of Chartism only with the state. The state can issue the money, and there is no possibility for non-legal tender, so to speak. Only for legal tender is a place. But that idea is not Chartism in the original form. And by emphasizing the Polanyi's idea of money, we can have more wide variety of the idea and somehow the fruitful implication from Chartism. And that's my idea. So here is the essence of the neo-Polanyian approach. And actually, Sayagu, he integrated Polanyi's idea with John Common's idea of debt as a successor of Knapp. But I don't go into detail of that. And anyway, the key conceptual finding of Polanyi, according to Sayag, and which I follow, is that money is a system of accounting and settlement of debt. And Polanyi's the originality lies in the distinction of two different levels of the abstraction of money. Firstly, money as a concept, and secondly, the money as a set of instrument and practice. And I find this distinction still valid and very useful in order to analyze current situation about cryptocurrency, crypto asset, and so on. And I'd like to emphasize one more point, that recently the money as a concept has been getting more and deeper influence from money as a set of instrument and practices. And I will explain about it now. Okay, and everyone knows that Libra Project. It was in June 2019 when the birth of the Libra Project was announced by Facebook, a world famous networking company, as we all know. And they said Libra is a new type of payment system. And they had Libra coins with Libra Reserve, with Visa, MasterCard, Vodafone, and so on, even though some of them had to withdraw after a while. And they have a really huge volume of reserve. And with this, Libra coins works very well, they said. And they have a white paper, and the strange name for cryptocurrencies and so on. But anyway, in this, according to this white paper, Libra coins is a kind of basket or a set of stable coins for this payment, and consisting on one hand with the normal or the conventional currency stable coins, and of multi-currency coin of Libra. it's a kind of the combination or basket. And as we see from this terminology, so Libra is an outcome, the very important outcome of the development of stable coins. And stable coins is a technical term, not the normal stable coin, but rather one particular kind of cryptocurrency. And normally cryptocurrencies like Bitcoins, they have really a high volatility of the price or the exchange rate to legal tender. But because of that, some people thought, well, maybe it's not a good idea to have this kind of volatility. It will lose the trust of the people, so that they had devised a kind of device to reduce the volatility of the exchange rate of cryptocurrencies. That's stable coins. And there are a bunch of stable coins right now, but some people say, well, Tether found it as a real coin in the year of 2015 was really an important one for the birth of Libra. And I think so too. Well, I'm not so much used to this kind of cryptocurrencies and stable coins, but so far as I read the several the references and so on, it's true. And actually this Tether is pegged with the US dollar. And in that sense, it was and is a kind of stable. And this idea has been developed into the idea of Libra coins too. And from this point, normally people, or some people can think that it's between legal tender and cryptocurrencies because it's a kind of stable and backed with legal tender. But on the other hand, the history shows only several years though that this idea of stablecoin gradually diminished the sovereignty of the state, and we will see how it developed. Okay, well, here is a figure of digital money tree proposed by 2 members of IMF. Actually, well, I can't see the names well here. Actually, these authors, Adrian and Mancini Grifoli, they made a fintech report. So shortly after the birth of Libra, it was July, their fintech report was published in July 2019, so 1 month after the birth of Libra, and they showed that new taxonomy of money is now necessary, and this is a classification. And first, of digital monies. And first, digital money should be classified according to the type, whether it is claim or an object. If it's an object, okay, in the payment, you pay with this object, and that's it. It's done. But if it's a claim, then it should be, the value should be redeemed afterwards. So now is a classification. How is the value, whether it's fixed or variable? And then if it is variable, of course, we can get profit from that. And actually, it will lead to the idea of Libra. But it's not the point actually with this classification. Here is a fixed value. This should be backstopped by someone, by some authority. And there are 2 types of backstops. And one is the very conventional government, as we know. And if government is a backstop of this fixed value redemption, then it will be just normal bank money. And we all know, even though it's a digital money, the debit card and so on, it's very conventional for us too. But if the backstop is private, this phenomenon is quite new for us. So AltPay, WeChat Pay, and so on, or USD coins and so on, these are called as e-money or electronic money. And this idea is really new, even though cryptocurrency is in a different line. And they say, these authors from IMF, even though this report is only individual, not as the idea of institution of IMF. I think some connection to IMF is still there, and they worried about this new presence or new birth of e-money at that time, so around the time of the birth of Libra. Why is it? Here, yeah, they expressed serious concern for e-money, saying that the two most common forms of money today will face tough competition and could even be surpassed. Cash and bank deposit will battle with e-money, electronically stored monetary value, denominated in and pegged to a common unit of account, such as euro, dollar, or renminbi, or a basket thereof, like Libra. Increasingly popular forms of e-money are stable coins. Here we are. So they are worried about e-money at most. And why? Because the backstop for redemption guarantee can also be private. And of course, there is a risk for central banks to lose monetary policy control. We can immediately see this risk. And more than that, of course, there's a risk for the imposition of tax on the profit. But I'd like to emphasize here, the electronic money institutions can be private, and they show a new, different kind of centralization for investment and profit. Okay, next page. I'd like to show you.
Chikako, we're approaching the 2-minute mark now.
Okay, please see it. It's a list of the numbers of this kind of the private electronic money institutions, even though it was authorized by banks and so on. It's quite a bunch. You know, for example, UK have 235 institutions like this. And also, for example, Lithuania, 64, and so on. And somehow this list reminds us of tax haven. No? And in that sense, these people were worrying about this presence. Okay, I'd like to skip much of the detail. But anyway, I'd like to come to the implications of the neo-Polanyian perspective. And maybe here I will skip this part. There is some further tendency of monetary practices. Then recently, the rise of the different kind of accounting to meet the requirement of globalization, it's International Financial Reporting Standard, IFRS. And many people say, well, the accounting system shouldn't be domestic anymore because of that kind of the global trend of finance and cryptocurrencies. Actually, here we can see a shift of attention from cryptocurrency to crypto asset. As the money tree shows, it matters more with claims, not the object. So that it's not currency, but rather asset, which matters. And in that sense, somehow, using the Polanyian, the neo-Polanyian terminology, it's the influence of monetary practice and instrument on the concept of money itself. But it's also more important is a reconsideration of money as a concept too. If the concept of money is somehow treated as given, as a storage of value or the means of speculation and so on, there's no stoppage, no possibility of stop to this trend. And what is the role of the state? It can be more than resorting to regulatory measures, we have to say. The state can also stand for the side of people against global companies. And in that sense, from our side, from the side of people, it's quite important to retain the possibility of decentralized technology blockchain to our side and to give some pressure to the state. That's also important from the neo-Polanyian perspective. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. It is a race against clock in the panels, it seems, most of the time. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the questions now. And there's a number of questions, so let's start. I'm going to go around and ask a question for each of the panelists first. Does everybody, you can turn your cameras on, and maybe we can all be on the screen at the same time. I think that makes sense at this point. Everyone go ahead and put your cameras on, your videos on. So the first question came in to Julianna and Michelle, and it's from Jerome Warren. And Jerome says, your talk did for the most part not address the gig economy. Glad to hear you mention Amazon later in the talk. I'd be curious to hear your reaction to someone like Aaron Benanav, who wrote a book on automation recently. He seems to suggest the idea that automation will necessarily displace workers is mistaken, and looks at examples like Uber to make a contradictory point that Uber invests in automation, self-driving cars, but wound up being a low-wage enterprise like Walmart. To what extent is automation influenced by questions of distribution, and to what extent are fears of robots, the quote-unquote robots replacing us, overblown?
Thank you for the question. I actually answered it in the chat. Yeah,
Julianna, the participants can't see.
Yeah, I know.
So that's why we're doing it
sure.
Publicly.
We couldn't grasp too many things in a paper, so this is why things have to be left out. And basically, we were focusing on understanding the implications of the core periphery and to bring actually these dimensions into the discourse rather than disentangling all of the aspects. The idea of automation that would necessarily displace workers, actually our argument is in line with this comment that we do argue that there is a displacement of workers on the local level if we look at the factories, if we look at the production sites. But in general, the economy is shifting from industries to industries. So on the whole logic of how the sectors are being restructured creates further jobs. And that was the other end of the studies included in our study that actually point to the fact that the jobs do not disappear. And we saw that, for example, in the core countries, the unemployment rates are not really changing because of automation. It's not the automation that would change unemployment rates in the core countries, but it can actually, by relocating production through automation processes in the long run, that means the outsourced, manual, low-skilled jobs, which are, for example, overseas, can be relocated. And there is a tendency to relocate all these productions with automation into the domestic countries that can induce some tension globally. I mean, you know, the production sites will be not longer there in the periphery, for example. That can be a consequence. Another idea was, like the Uber's example. Uber is a wonderful case study, actually, I do think so. Also, if looking at the structure of how people were not employed, how can they be employed, and how the regulation was shifting employment structure within the gig economy is an interesting case study to my view. But my comment on this is like it ends up with being a low-wage enterprise. We do need to understand in the short and middle term how much has to be invested into automation and the benefits of automation, how much the costs and benefits for companies themselves. So if it's too expensive to invest in automation within a couple of years, of course, companies will not be interested in that. because we have to wait out until all the solutions become cheaper, as in all type of technological innovations and innovation adaptation processes are a bit more complex than just a mere, how to say, shift all of a sudden to absolutely automatized and self-driving cars. We also need a regulatory system to allow for some of these innovations, as we know. So self-regulating cars do need some regulations on state and international level so that they can be used on the streets. It's I mean, we can invest in them. If we cannot use them, it's a problem. The fears of robots replacing us, as I mentioned, it's probably connected to those classes of social layers who are affected by losing their jobs. And there are people who will not be able to find jobs after losing their jobs in an industrial plant because of automation. So that is a risk that people can face, actually. But in a macroeconomic perspective, it doesn't mean that the long-term unemployment will grow. Just think about the industrial revolutions and how, or even the example of Ford again, how automation took jobs, but actually it created other jobs. And we ended up with the Great Depression, but a lot of opportunities were emerging. And also we need to understand other dynamics, like, I don't know, like the peace economy or the war economy, and where the state is investing in what type of innovations the state is investing, what industries it is growing or not, because these focuses are shifting too. Thanks.
Thanks, Juliana. There are a couple questions for Ilias and Adam, and I'm going to, Margie Mendel's question is short, so I'm going to put them together. So you've got one question, Jerome's right in here with the first question again, for Ilias and Adam. And Jerome says, I don't care for the term state capitalism, as this term is heavily colored through the history of the Soviet Union. It may be necessary to more explicitly distinguish what you speak of from the Warsaw Pact countries and PRC. Or to ask it differently, how does your definition of state capitalism differ from what was attributed to the USSR? And then I'm also going to tack on to that, this is a separate question from Margie, who's asks Ilias and Adam if they have looked at the important work of Trebor Schultz.
You want to start? Or?
Go ahead.
Right, thanks for interesting questions. Yes, Jerome, it is true that the term state capitalism, because of its long history, has been pejoratively used by certain actors. So at the moment, for instance, it is used by people who are close to Western policymaking circles or business circles to kind of speak badly about China or Russia or Hungary, and so on. In other words, political economies where it seems that the state is very present and powerful. And it is also true that in previous rounds of debates about state capitalism, so in the 80s, in the 70s, but also in the 30s, state capitalism meant different things. And so in the 30s, for instance, it has been used to refer to the Nazi regime. Later on, it has been used to refer to the classical developmental state. It's been used to refer to state monopoly capitalism, in Marxist debates. So it is true that it has a long history, and there's a geopolitical connotation to the term as well, an ideological one, and so on and so forth. What we do is that we actually look at how the term is used in current debates, and we try and unpack those different uses. And we're in fact quite critical. We wrote a paper recently on this, where we kind of make the argument that, a bit like I mentioned earlier, the use of the term state capitalism to kind of smear China and picture it as this kind of abnormal version of capitalism is a way to also pose, the American capitalism as a virtuous democratic version of capitalism, and so on and so forth. So we kind of agree with your comment. And we also think that there's lots of problems with simply the expression state capitalism, notably the fact that it seems to imply that non-state capitalism has no state. But of course, the state is always important in capitalism. It has always been, perhaps it will, always be. And we do not kind of neglect that. What we try and do is kind of salvage the category state capitalism and find a way to use it productively. And so this is why we try to make this argument about state capitalism being a particular form of state restructuring, which again, we don't consider to be abnormal or deviant from normal capitalism. We actually think that it is something that is always there. And we try and reflect on what conditions, political, economic conditions, kind of push for state capitalism to emerge at certain historical conjunctures. And the second, do you want to add something to that?
Ilias, I made a mistake. Margie's just now indicating that was a question meant for Julianna. So maybe we could put that question on hold, and I'll field one for Chikako, and then we can come back around and I can ask that question to Julianna.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think it's a mistake that it was addressed to me because I'm not using state capitalism. So it was for you guys.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Let's. I'm going to field one for Chikako, and then we'll come around and have round two. And Margie has another question lined up for Ilias and Adam. So, Chikako, this is from Margie as well. Chikako, very interesting paper. I think you spoke about this, but please elaborate on the relation of e-currencies to hard currency and how this gets played out within individual countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe it's not a question, but rather a comment. And today I explained about the importance of the development of stable coins because it's a basket of this kind of hard currency. Not only the digital one, but also the hard currency of legal tender and crypto digital currency. But maybe Margie point out that maybe not only the basket, but rather just the influence on the normal money should be considered here. Thank you very much for the comment. I'll think it over further. Thank you.
Okay, maybe let's head back to Julianna. So Julianna, the question about Trevor Schultz was actually meant for you as well. And so I will kind of ask you about that as well as tack on this another question, again from Margie Mendel. Great paper, Julianna. Are you also looking at platform cooperatism, an important and interesting way to decommodify the platform economy, counterpoise to, for example, Uberization? Thanks for your talk.
Yes, and I really appreciate that comment from Margie, and also she suggested me later to read Trevor Schultz. And I'm really grateful for this because this is the future line of my research. Honestly, I've been basically doing research with maker spaces, collaborative design, collaborative open digital innovation, hackathons, and digital startups. So that was basically the grassroots of how to understand the public, the private, and the community. Pushed by some other forces of the market. And so basically this is the line which I would love to follow right now. That's what I can comment on, and thanks.
Okay, another question, coming back to Ilias and Adam. Thank you for your excellent paper. You call into question quote unquote new state intervention. But as COVID continues without the end in sight, will state crisis management strategies across countries converge?
So thanks for the question. So just to put this into perspective, the argument that we're making is not one that like a hyperglobalization convergence thesis, right? So we still see variegation. That's why we employ uneven and combined development, because that allows for difference across political economies, taking into account local contingency, history, different capacities. So we wouldn't see per se a convergence into all states using the same modalities. We would see different types of intervention being employed.
Yes, if I may just add something to that, I think one of the reasons why we think that no convergence can happen is that as part of those processes of state restructuring that we're discussing or that we're witnessing, we think that states are presented with different opportunities and constraints depending on their position in the international division of labor. And so, and because this international division of labor, unfolds across territorial boundaries, then there cannot be national convergence in terms of institutional trajectories.
Thank you. And we have a question here from Klaus Thomasberger for Chikako. How does Hayek's idea of denationalizing money fit into your scheme?
Oh yeah, thank you, Klaus, now for a nice question. Yeah, actually, I also find it quite important to see Hayek's treatise on the denationalization of money, published in 1970s. But actually, since the birth of Bitcoin in 2008 or so, this Hayek's article is always the frame of reference for many people, because it has the distinction between the national legal tender and the nationalized money. And actually, I wrote one article about it, and there I pointed out that for Hayek, it was quite important that he had an experience in the interwar period, the Great Depression and so on, where the legal tender did lose the trust of the people, and so that there are many attempts to find new form of money, including get the Sylvia Gazelles and so on. And actually, a little bit deviation, and there's one article about stablecoin, which I recently referred to, and they start their explanation from the beer, the Swiss beer, and that was also founded in interwar period, and that's one deviation. Anyway, back to the theme of Hayek, and that the experience was quite important for Hayek in the 30s or 20s and 30s, and then he wrote an article in the 70s about the denationalization of money. And another point is that Hayek he changed the attitude of money. First, he thought, well, the state should issue the money, and that's all. But because of the presence of the increase of euro-dollar, Hayek changed his mind. That was my point. The point which I wrote in my article. And anyway, Hayek's idea was quite important. But somehow this article, this treatise of Hayek is not enough, I thought, seeing the presence or the birth of Libra. And there is a difference between stable coins and cryptocurrencies, as I explained today. And since several years, cryptocurrencies, of course, they increase in number, the bunch of cryptocurrencies until now, but somehow the problem seems to be more with crypto asset. And many people say, well, it's not money, but it doesn't matter whether it's money or not, but rather as a meaning or as a practice or institutions, and they need to grasp the idea of crypto asset. And that's why today I focus my emphasis rather on crypto asset. Okay, but still I have to think it over and still what Hayek's idea fit into this theme. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, we have another question for Julianna from Francisco Bozana Barnes. And this question is, technological innovation is conditioned by tradition, which leads to promoting creative solutions. Why not focus on social creativity and democracy?
Thank you for the great question. I'll try not to answer it in a too complex way. As far as I see, actually, the whole agenda of creativity and innovation, my understanding that creativity is also a social construct being around nowadays, and as much as innovation, that we are looking for innovation all the time. And mostly we think about innovation as a technological sense, which promotes our economies. And creativity has stepped into that domain too. So we see creativity, creative solutions, also an agenda which promotes somehow our economies. Just think about the creative economies agenda. And so I'm not sure what is the connection here, but if we're looking into some grassroots, flow-driven social creativity in this question, that I absolutely subscribe to this idea. So we do need to deconstruct what has been constructed on top of the creativity domain nowadays. And I do like this connection of social creativity, if we talk about this in this sense, like liberating people to really to create, and it does need democratic arrangements. I absolutely agree with that point.
Julianna, Francisco also asked for a bit of a follow-up on your last question, and he just wrote in the Q&A, in which way, and it's a bit cryptic, but I think you were talking about, I have to go back, cooperatism. Let me go back and try to find, oh yeah, you were responding to Margie's question about platform cooperatism, and looking at different ways of decommodifying the platform economy in opposition to what we've seen with respect to Uber. And Francisco, oh, thanks. Okay, no, he's happy as we reports now in the Q&A. I'm just checking because the questions are now scattered across different windows. I'm just trying to make sure that we have actually answered all the questions in both streams. There's one more question has come in from Jerome Warren again, who congratulates you all on an excellent discussion, and wants to shout out to the organizers of the event that the moderation has been great. Well, on behalf of the moderators, thanks, Jerome. So we thank you. Yes, doing our best, doing our best to keep track of the Q&A as they come in. We do have a couple minutes. I don't know if any of the panelists want to speak to each other or speak back and forth, or ask each other questions. You can. We have a few minutes to do that. If you want to ask each other questions or had thought of a question while you're going along and you wanted to ask, you can just turn on your microphone and go ahead and do that.
Can I ask a question to Ilias?
Of course.
And Adams? In the slide, you talked about somehow the unconventional monetary policy or so, and it didn't show up too much in the presentation, and because it was not the focus point. But if you can explain about it a little bit more, I would be very thankful.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think we just meant mostly the monetary policy response since the 2008 global financial crisis. So encompassing quantitative easing and all the massive programs of purchasing debt and bonds, and more recently with the COVID pandemic, central banks using monetary policy to actually play a fiscal role. So, you know, again, back in Europe, for instance, and in the US, and so on. So this is mostly what we were referring to. I think, yeah.
I see, thanks.
Hi, everyone. This is Michelle. Can I ask a quick question?
Beverly, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I am muted because it's as Murphy's Law, there's construction started this morning right below my window. And so I'm trying to cancel that as much as possible and mute myself whenever I can. Michelle, please do jump in and ask a question.
Thank you. Oops. Am I muted now? Okay. Just so following that, guys, I just had a question about your point. It was brought up as a point, and then you were using it also to justify the argument. Where are you drawing from to substantiate the industrial policy evolution? Just curious.
So can you ask your question again? I'm sorry, I missed it a bit.
So you brought it up as a point, and then later you had it as a bullet as like bullet number one. Your industrial policy, I think you said, is increasing or it's returning, or how are you substantiating that? What are your sources?
Right, yeah, I think so. Yeah, this is an argument I couldn't develop, but it's we're referring to the fact that there's been a competitive emulation happening between different states. So, you know, for instance, China trying to enter the microchip market requires heavy industrial policy, and this is matched by some form of industrial policy response in the US, which is then, you know, matched by some further adjustment by China in terms of industrial policy.
Right, so this techno-nationalism type of approach, right? And yeah. Are you isolating that only to the BRIC countries, or how are you mapping that as a trend, or however you see? Where are you drawing the sources from?
So partly it's not simply a material evolution, but it's also in the discourse, right? So if you think, you know, the example I always pull from is that the US spending $750 billion a year on defense is industrial policy, and it has been. I mean, they can say it's national defense, but what we see is there's increasing legitimation of industrial policy as even being allowed to be talked about, that it's something. So for example, I was at an OECD event a few years ago, and the head of the development center there said, it's very refreshing. We can say industrial policy. Just being able to say that is, I think, a sea change, particularly at places like the OECD, but even the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF, there was this IMF paper, right? That there was a research paper that came out with the title that said it was something like, I don't remember exactly, like the policy that will remain
that shall not be named.
That shall be not named, right? And it's industrial policy, and there's an increasing embrace of these that it's okay to be more active in developing industries and not simply leaving it to the market.
Yeah, and it's not just the BRICS. I mean, if you know, France and Germany and the UK, they've all been releasing plans which are essentially forms of industrial policy and speaking more and more about creating national champions. And those plans are framed as direct responses to the rise of China, but not only. Again, to use the example of the creation of digital champions in Europe, this is to compete with China and South Korea, so East Asian countries, but also with the US, where the claim is made all the time that we missed our opportunity to develop digital champions, that we have to use industrial policy both at the national and at the union level to start and be able to compete with them. There's also across the developing world, again, much beyond the BRICS, all sorts of development plans which often encompass industrial policy elements, often combined with a focus on infrastructure development. So it seems really to be everywhere, in fact. And it is also full of IMF reports now, OECD reports, World Bank reports, UNCTAD, and so on and so forth.
Well, everyone, this brings us right up to the end of the session, and we're right at the break for 15 minutes before our first keynote of the day begins. So I just want to thank all our panelists for 3 great, rich presentations. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants for their great questions, and see you virtually here and there for over the next few days. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.